let me say, my hope is that the President will endorse that commission and that we can pass it early this year and actually have it up and running by summer. There's supposed to be a White House conference. We passed a bill last fall to establish a White House conference on retirement, which will meet this year and again in a couple of years. And so this commission could work right in with that system. And I hope the President will agree to endorse it.
You can see the speech by House Speaker Newt Gingrich in its entirety tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 Pacific, on C-SPAN.
Now, issues of identity in the African American community from a former member of the Nation of Islam. Sonsyrea Tate talks about her book, Little X, Growing Up in the Nation of Islam. This 20-minute interview was recorded last month.
Sonsyrea Tate, author of Little X. In your book, you talk about your life as a young girl growing up in the Nation of Islam. Let me begin by first asking you to describe your family's life prior to joining the Nation.
Prior to joining the Nation of Islam, my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, were in a holiness church. In fact, my paternal great-grandfather was one of the founders of the Church of Bethlehem in a holiness church here in the district. And he raised my grandmother and his other 13 children in this church. And my grandmother became disillusioned with the mainstream black church, which the holiness church was a part of. And she and her husband later joined the Nation of Islam once they started their family. And they had, I think, 5 or 6 children at the time. And what appealed to them was that for the first time in their life, someone was telling them that they too were created in the image of God. They had never heard that, never considered that black folks were created in the image of God. And so that's what attracted them initially to the Nation of Islam.
Now, who was Fard Muhammad?
Fard Muhammad, so the story goes, was the original founder of the Nation of Islam back in 1930. And in the book I touch on him Fard Muhammad starting the Nation of Islam in Detroit, in the slums of Detroit in the 1930s during the Depression, and then Elijah Muhammad took over a few years later. Elijah Muhammad actually combined some of what he had learned under Marcus Garvey as far as the nationalism that he applied or that he fashioned the Nation of Islam out of. So Elijah Muhammad took over in the mid-30s. And there was quite a bit of trouble getting started, but it grew from there. And my grandparents had joined back in the 50s.
Now, it's quite a move from a Christian or Baptist environment, or let's say even a Pentecostal environment, to the Nation of Islam. Now, spiritually, what did your family gain by making that move? What wasn't your family getting from the mainstream or traditional church?
What they were not getting from the traditional church was the sense, black folks back in those days were not taught that they were created in the image of God. In fact, they were taught the opposite. So my grandmother describes what they were getting as reverse psychology, whereas they had been told they were the scum of the earth, they were the evil ones. Along comes Elijah Muhammad preaching the opposite. And it was, I guess it was a sort of a way for them to heal psychologically from the damages of racism.
Now, explain how the nation goes about achieving unity and solidarity.
They have very intense practices to achieve unity and solidarity. I think people get into it for the unity and solidarity that they didn't feel a part of out in mainstream society. They impress upon the individual a sense of responsibility to the group. You have to work for the group. I know back when my father was a child, the Nation of Islam required that the brothers sell a certain number of newspapers or pay out of their pockets because they were trying to build a nation. And because blacks did not feel like they were appreciated in mainstream society, the idea of building their own nation, an all-black nation, appealed to many, and brothers worked hard. Brothers worked at the restaurants. Well, sisters worked hard too, because when the brothers were out working for no money, sometimes at these restaurants, working very long hours just to build this all-black nation, that they believed in at the time, the sisters were home and they had to finagle with the meager funds that they had. So, but everybody was committed to the idea of this sort of utopia society, which in theory is good, but in practicality is another story.
Can you describe for us your dress as a young girl in the nation and also your day-to-day life and activities?
As you know, Muslim women are taught to cover from head to toe. So you don't want to show your curves because it might incite some man to view you as a sexual object. So we wore long skirts and a long loose-fitting top and a head covering in the interest of modesty. But by the time I was 13, I argued with my mother that the way that my Muslim dress was not modest because it distinguished me. And to that point, I thought it called more attention to myself. And that was the opposite effect of what the Muslim dress was supposed to do. What else can I say about the dress? Well, the dress supposedly was in the interest of modesty. But I have problems with that because I think that we were born with beautiful curves, and because men may lust over that, I don't think the burden of covering up should be on the women. Men should have to put that lust in check.
Now, let's say while you're on that note, you also write about how black women viewed you as a child and also viewed your mother and your grandmother because of the dress you wore. Can you elaborate?
Well, not just because of the dress, but because of the role of the Muslim women, the Muslim woman. When I was coming along in the 70s, women were making strides to break the barriers of the traditional role of the woman. The women wanted to go out of the house and wanted to be respected beyond their domestic roles. But Muslim women, I know as a Muslim girl, I was taught that being a mother and a wife is the most important job a woman could have. I do believe those are important jobs, but I don't think they're the only jobs a woman can have. And I don't think it's necessarily the woman's job. I think it's convenient to have roles for everyone in the family. But we were trying to, I guess, conform to these roles while other women outside of our religion were breaking down barriers.
Now, how did your life as a young girl, and of course as you matured into your teens, how did that differ from the lives of other girls in the community?
I think most of us broke away, most of my peers in the nation. What we maintained were some of the lessons that we learned about maintaining homes and taking care of ourselves. But most of us really did not want to be confined to the house.
Is there any place for individualism in the nation?
Not when I was there. In fact, my mother was chastised for her individuality. You were supposed to wear certain uniforms in certain colors, and if you did not, you were escorted to the back of the seating section. The Nation of Islam was about conforming to the Nation of Islam's policies and practices because I guess in that unity, if you have a block of people doing the same thing, then there's power in that. So there was no room for individuality.
Now let's focus on education. Now you mentioned that the Nation of Islam teaches children, black children, to love themselves. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, almost daily we had what were called actual facts, and these were bits of information according to Elijah Muhammad. And according to our history, people of color were the first people on the earth. So our history started with that as opposed to starting with people of color as slaves here in America. And it was good for us to learn to connect, to connect to our history since before slavery and to connect to other people across the globe.
Now, what did the nation teach you about people such as Columbus and Martin Luther King?
We had a different take on American history. We did not believe Columbus discovered America. Of course, we were taught early on that there were already people living here and that this ship of guys came over and basically ran the people off the land. Martin Luther King, we did not honor him as a leader because we were not into integration to the point of assimilating to someone else's culture. We wanted to value ourselves, value our ancestors.
Now, one of the other things that was part of your, I would say, your academic life at that time, or instruction, there was a lot of discussion about white people. To quote you here, I was learning to hate white people without even knowing them.
Yeah, as we recited daily that we were the original man's, the maker's owner, original man, maker, owner, cream of the planet Earth, and there's a whole another part to that. We were also taught the reverse of what my great-grandparents had been taught. We were taught that the Caucasian race was the evil, wicked race. And my problem with that is what happened with my father's generation when they grew up in this all-black nation of Islam that everybody believed in, because if the white man is the devil, then we can build our all-black nation and we won't have these same evils. But to grow up and then find out that evil really has no color line, that greed has no color line, that corruption has no color line, because these are, you know, human ills, but to have packaged everything in terms of black and white in order to fight what previous generations had been taught. I guess, I know it had, at some point you have to reverse the damage, but I don't think, there must be another way to do it.
Okay. Keeping in line with that same thought, now the book is set here in the nation's capital where you grew up. What were your views as a young child, and the views also of other members of the Nation of Islam towards the capital and the power which the men in the capital supposedly had?
Wicked. We were taught that, well, if you look at the history of what white men in power in America have done, based on that history, they did not do nice things to African American people. And so we were taught that, and so of course we viewed them with skepticism. But as I grew older, I became involved in the political process, volunteering on campaigns as early as, I guess, 18 or 19. And I went to work for a congresswoman recently because I do believe that America is for all of us, and I don't believe in divisions on either side. I don't believe in Nation of Islam teaching that all white people are inherently evil, and I don't believe in covering up the nasty history of Africans here in America either.
Can you further describe your first interactions with white people?
My first interactions with white people, oh, I was thinking it was when I worked an internship, but come to think of it, back in high school, I was accepted to a writing program for high school kids at the Smithsonian, and that was my first interaction, the Smithsonian Museum's downtown. And by then, I had been away from the Nation of Islam for a few years, and as an Orthodox Muslim, I was now being taught that that God loves us all, and that there are Caucasian Muslims as well as, you know, Muslims of every race and every color. So by the time I was meeting white people, I no longer believed that they were all evil.
Okay. Now, in terms of your career, you are also a journalist. Your resume includes work experience with the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and so forth. And in watching the media, there's often criticism in terms of how the Nation of Islam feels it is depicted by the media. Is there serious criticism of, or false criticism of the nation as you see it?
Is there serious criticism?
Or is the criticism false? Not rooted?
I think because of the Nation of Islam's high profile in the 1970s and because of the Nation of Islam's high profile now, particularly following the Million Man March, they're getting attention because attention, well, that kind of news sells. But I think if you look at any major organization, if you look at any large church organization, you can find you can find something that would be newsworthy. But because of the Nation of Islam's high profile and potential power, I think they're under scrutiny.
Any lessons that should have been taken from the Million Man March?
Oh, I think to bring that many individuals together and not come forth with some sort of agreement or plan. It was good that I heard a lot of the men did go back into their communities and began volunteering at organizations. But it would be nice to have had some way to measure the impact of such a gathering.
Now let me ask you, can you describe your family for me in two contexts? One is when your family was part of the nation, and after your family left the nation. How did your family change?
Ooh. When my family was in the nation, everyone tried to conform to a role. My grandmother she did conform to her role as a Muslim woman, staying in the home, nurturing her family. And my grandfather was the provider, and he took care of the family. My mother tried, but she was just not a woman. She just had too much energy to confine in the house. There was so much disillusionment coming out of the nation. I think that's where the real damage was done, because my family had basically withdrawn from mainstream society into this all-black society, thinking that it would be a better way of life. Indeed, we learned some lessons to help on a daily basis, practical lessons about nutrition and practical things. The women learned to sew, learned to plan nutritious meals, learned to sit down with the children for homework. But the broader ideas that we learned that, white is good white is bad and black is good, they're evil, we're gods. And then to come to understand that that's not so, that in this all-black society, you can still feel quite disenfranchised. You can still feel ostracized. You can still feel, in our all-black society, you had your rank and file here and your leaders there with double standards. You had your corruption. You had the same dynamics that you have in any group of people. You had it in the Nation of Islam. My family didn't understand that going in.
And finally, what caused you and your family to leave the nation?
My mother left the nation about a year before Elijah Muhammad died. After Elijah Muhammad passed, his son took the organization toward Orthodox Islam, and most of my family followed him toward Orthodox Islam, which he told us that much of what his father had taught us was plain old not true. The philosophies, the theology that he had created, his son explained the intent behind it. But now to bring people, because we had practiced these religious tenets with such intensity, now to find out that it was, basically made up. For a lot of the people, it was a difficult transition. I know for me, just being